Hi, this is Matthew Trigali with Smart Shield Property Management. In today's video, we're going to answer the question, what should you do if your tenant has trashed your property in the Charlotte, North Carolina area? So the first thing we want to figure out here is, are we talking about a property that is still occupied by the tenant or vacant? If it's still occupied by the tenant, then you have some leverage over the tenant. You have some decisions to make here. Your main decision to make is, do you really want to still keep working with this tenant? Or is the best thing to do here really to give the tenant notice and ask them to move out as quickly as possible so that you can just kind of move on from this situation? Or if the tenant is not, if the damage is not so bad, then you can try to work with the tenant to get those things repaired at their expense, of course. Now, most commonly we get this question when the property is already vacant, the tenant has moved out, and the landlord goes in to review the property for the first time since the tenant has moved out, and it's just shocking what they see. And so the first thing I want to say to you here is, I know it can feel like an emotional roller coaster, but really you need to stay focused on the business decisions you have to make. You became a landlord, and so you need to treat this property like a business. This can be especially hard if this property used to be your own home that you lived in. There can be a lot of emotional attachments and memories here, but treat it like a business that it is. So the tenant has moved out. What do you do next? The first business decision you have to make here is, while there's a lot of things you may need to work through with that tenant who's just left, the first thing you need to focus on here is your number one job is to get this property re-rented as quickly as possible. So that means whether the tenant is cooperative, whether the tenant's in touch with you or not, regardless, you need to do the things that are necessary to make the appropriate improvements to the property, get it back on the market, and get it rented as quickly as possible. Because sitting vacant while you deal with the tenant is just going to add more expense to your situation when you're trying to minimize your expense going forward. So back to the tenant. So the first things we want to see here is insurance at all an option to factor into this situation? You can start by coordinating with the renter's insurance and seeing if whatever has happened is something that the renter's insurance is something that they will cover. If it is something that is accidental and not necessarily negligent on behalf of the tenant, then perhaps your own homeowner's insurance might cover it. I'd only recommend that if you happen to have a low deductible or if the claim really is going to be that particularly high. Both of those insurance routes tend to be really rare and probably are not going to be your best choice, but worth mentioning depending on how severe the situation is. Okay, so the next thing to do here is to try to work with your tenant and of course come up with a list of expenses, send it to the tenant, and let them know that you expect to collect this money from the tenant. Chances are they're not going to pay. And so then you have a decision to make here, really three different routes you could go with this. You could try to settle, collect, or have a judgment. So settlement is always going to be your best option here. It's going to be one of your only options to collect some money from the tenant. So let's say they did some damage that you've decided reasonably is worth $4,000, and you reach out to the tenant and they're willing to pay you $1,500 and move on. That's a business decision for you to make. Probably it will make sense for you to just take that $1,500 and move on from that situation and go forward. If the tenant is not offering you any type of reasonable settlement or is not communicating at all, which will be pretty typical, then you have a decision to make here if you want to put them into collections or pursue a judgment. So a judgment can feel like a good way to go, but it'll add more expense to your situation that's already expensive. You're most likely going to need to get an attorney to help you out, or at the very least you'll have court costs involved. But the bigger problem with the judgment is that the tenant has to be personally served in order for you to pursue that judgment against them. And it can be really challenging to personally serve them unless you happen to have some information of where a sheriff or somebody could go and personally serve the court papers to them. If you don't have that information, or if you don't want to have that added expense, then it's really not going to make sense to pursue a judgment. And even if you get that judgment, by the time that all of this has happened, chances are they're in a position where they may not care about their credit at that point. So it could be a very long time, if ever, that you even have the ability to collect on the judgment. The much cheaper way to go is to simply send them to collections. And so you can work with a collection agency, send that final accounting over to the collection agency so that it will go on their credit report, and there are usually different options that you could go with the collection agency, either for them to aggressively pursue the tenant or for to simply put it on their credit report. But either way, if that tenant ever in the future goes to get a car loan or a mortgage, this will come up and they may reach out to you to try to settle with you at that time. Okay, so these are a lot of, again, business decisions you have to make on how to move forward. The last thing I want to leave you with here is the importance of tenant screening. Now, of course, having a tenant trashing a property, it can happen to anybody. Don't feel bad about it. The tenant may have passed great tenant screening and something just changed in their life, or they let somebody into the house they shouldn't have and things just went south quickly. Nevertheless, use this as an opportunity to learn from that situation and see if there are ways that you can fine-tune your tenant screening process to really avoid this type of situation in the future. If you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out to us at Smart Shield Property Management, the intelligent investor's choice.